Hey there, it's Olivia Savannah here from Olivia's Catastrophe, and today I'm so excited because I'm going to talk about my favourite books of 2021. So I've decided this year not to do a worst books of 2021 video. That is simply because I don't have many books that I read that were bad that I feel very passionate about disliking and like I really want to talk about them. There's only one book that I really didn't like last year. Which book could that be? But yes, there was only one book that I really didn't like last year, and I already filmed a 30-minute rant review that said everything I could possibly want to say about it, so I'll leave a link to that down below and you can count that as my worst book video. But instead I decided to channel all of this energy I have to talk about books to just talk about my favourite books and to absolutely love them and to give you more favourite books than I usually would, because last year I read 150 books and I was trying to narrow it down to 15 favourites as I usually do, but I could not do it because I read so many great books last year. So I've got the list of 18 and I hope that you enjoy and pick up these 18 books. The first book that I want to tell you about is Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. This was an absolutely delightful read. I would say this was a 5-star prediction for me, and it absolutely hit that mark. Hamnet is a book that is centered on Shakespeare and his wife and their children, and in this one the bubonic plague comes to their house and it starts to affect one of the children. And that's basically what this book is about, but I would like to say that it focuses on the children and the mother, and it does not focus on Shakespeare whatsoever. Shakespeare's name is not even mentioned in this one. What really captivated me about this book was the wife and that character, and how you could feel those themes of what it's like to be a mother, what it's like to be a wife, and what it's like when one of your children are ill. It just seared through me and truly affected me. Even though I am a young adult who is not married and does not have children, I was still feeling those emotions. This book is shrouded in grief, and I think the way that it talked about the grief, the way that the grief was woven into the story was beautiful as much as it was heartbreaking. I loved how it looked at these siblings, these twins, and kind of their complex, unique relationship as well. The writing, this was the first book that I read by Maggie O'Farrell, but it will definitely not be the last, because the writing in this was lyrical, it was beautiful, it was like singing through words, if that is even possible, and I can't recommend this book more. It was divine, it was wonderful, and I really liked how it shifted the focus from Shakespeare onto parenthood and family, and making it about all of the characters individually and unified rather than centering it all on him. Then I want to talk about The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. This is by far the best romance that I read this year. It was a delight. As you're going to see with my favourites books, I tend to read books that are heavy in terms of emotions and topics, and sometimes I think I forget to read happy books that are just going to give me happy vibes and good feelings, and that is what The Love Hypothesis served for me this year. So The Love Hypothesis follows Olive. She's a post-grad student who's working on a project, and she dates this boy for one single date and doesn't really like him and doesn't click with him, but then her best friend starts to click with that guy, but the best friend refuses to date him because of, you know, they're friends. Why would she do that to her best friend? So Olive needs to convince her best friend that she doesn't fancy this guy anymore, she can have him. So what Olive does is starts fake dating somebody else rather spontaneously, who just happens to be a professor at the school. And it is just delightful. I really liked the friendship group. I really liked seeing how the friends were their own individual characters with their own individual storylines and plots, but also were supporting Olive, our main character. Olive was just so relatable in the way that she stresses over the smallest things and sometimes doesn't acknowledge or recognize her self-worth, but nonetheless she's such a bright ray of sunshine. She's always cheerful, she's always there for the people around her, and she's just doing the best that she can do in a fairly chaotic manner, but we love to see it. And then there is Mr. Grumpy, the professor, who is the grumpiest of the grumps, but he's also quite sweet and protective and loving and kind. But I really enjoyed The Love Hypothesis. It just made me so happy to read it. The couple were really cute. It did talk about being a woman in STEM subjects and how that is difficult sometimes. I just thought it handled everything very well. It had a nice steamy scene moment in it that felt very realistic and true to itself, while also not overwhelming the story with loads and loads of steamy scenes. So I thought it was a perfect balance of everything enjoyable. I then want to recommend this memoir to you called Crying in Mart by Michelle Zauner. We're back on the theme of grief, folks, which you're going to come across a lot, because in this one Michelle Zauner is talking about her relationship to her mother, specifically talking about her loss of her mother to cancer. But it doesn't just focus on those moments of grief. While she is working through this grief and discussing this grief, she's going back to these beautiful memories that she has of her family. And I say beautiful, but maybe I shouldn't say beautiful, because it is complex. It is a messy, dynamic relationship between her mother and not understanding each other, and the miscommunications. Her mother is Korean and her dad is American, so she is Korean American, and sometimes that cultural difference and that cultural complication can interfere with their relationship. And it was just so interesting to see all of that woven into the grief that comes from the journey with cancer and the loss of cancer. And it was just so emotional and so raw and so honest. Michelle Zauner doesn't hide the times where maybe she made mistakes and she did things that weren't great, but also acknowledges that sometimes other people did things to her as well. So it was just a rounded, really beautiful, really harrowing, really touching memoir, and I can't recommend it more. I really loved seeing how the Korean culture was included in this one and how she connected to her mum through food and cooking and taste. It was emotional. It was really, really good. One of the best memoirs I read this year. The next book I have here is Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty, and this is the third and final book in the Daemabad trilogy. This is an adult fantasy series, and I was surprised, but this was definitely one of the best books I've read, most importantly because it was the third and final book in a series and it was such a good ending. I hope it's not only me who often finds series endings to be disappointing because there's so much riding on that ending and you have so many expectations, but Empire of Gold fulfilled all of those for me and more, and it ricocheted that series into my favourite series of all time list. So of course I just wanted to put Empire of Gold on here to just show how good this series truly is. The first book follows Nari, who is living in Egypt, and she is just trying to get by and make money, and she does this ritual which calls on the jinn from the heavens so that she can earn money, thinking it's fake, and it turns out to be real, and she is summoned a jinn and she gets swept off into this magical fantasy world that she never knew existed. And I think the synopsis for the first book sounds very, very stereotypical, but the series is not stereotypical whatsoever. It opens a doorway into this vastly complex Muslim Middle Eastern fantasy book that does setting so well, that has amazing character development, that has you rooting for romantic relationships in a very fun way. Prince Ali could marry me tomorrow and I would be so happy. That man is complex and messy, and you meet him in the first book and maybe you don't like him, but he develops so much by the end of it. And I have to say the same of Nari, our main character. She also develops so much across the series that I absolutely love seeing it. It was incredibly creative in the ways of the magic system working, but also in terms of the plot and the trials and tribulations they went through. I loved how there was not just one main villain across this story, across the trilogy. There was just so much more brought to the table on offer that was so much fun to go through. I do think the pacing in this series is not the best, and I'll say the same for the third book. The pacing could be a little bit better, but that said, it's a really good series. When I read Open Water by Caleb Azumah Nelson, I absolutely knew that this was immediately going to be on my favourites of the year list. This book is a short one and it's a romance between a man and a woman, but everything is from the man's perspective. The man is black, the man is British, and he's quite a romantic. He really romanticizes his life and the way he views art and the way he views people. and his relationship is a bit complicated because when he first meets the girl, she is dating his friend. It was so beautiful to me to see a book with a black British male main character who emotes so much, who is crying, who is feeling things, who doesn't know how to name or place his feelings but is still giving himself time to feel his way through them. I don't think I often see that in fiction, and it was beautiful to see. The writing in this was absolutely gorgeous. It was lyrical, it was lovely, it ran through the pages like silk. So I really enjoyed reading this one. It was short and it was quick, but it packed a punch, and I have to say I didn't expect to relate to the male character so much, but I really did. I felt very seen in the ways that he feels so anxious with his black experience and his black life, and feeling like he doesn't quite fit into places. And as someone who is very creative and artistic, it was nice to see that in a character as well. So I just felt like this was one of the books where it felt very much written for me, even though that's not the case. It just felt like it was written for me, and I drank it all in. We have to talk about the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. Yes, just like everyone else, I loved this science fiction book. So how can I explain it? In this book, we are set in this world where sessing exists, and people who can sess shift the earth and create earthquakes and make the earth move in different and mysterious ways. And you'd expect that those people would be the people with power in this world, but they are not. They are the downtrodden and the oppressed. And we're following a few characters in this world as some things that we believe to be facts about the world might turn out to be not fact, not true, and changeable. And the book goes in so many different places, in so many different directions, and all of them are absolutely fascinating. Even though there's a lot that you need to take in about the world, the author really guides you through it. She never explains everything to you point blank, but things get enough explaining that you never feel lost in the story. Except for during the prologue, but ignore the prologue, we pretend it does not exist, and we just read the rest of the book. You've been warned. The world building is expansive, it's creative. I know it's well researched because I've read interviews that N.K. Jemisin has done on all of the research she's done into this and put into this book, which is absolutely fascinating and fantastic. The character development, whoa, the character development is on a whole other level, and there are so many characters here that you can root for and really appreciate. I loved Hoa personally. I thought he was fantastic, but I also really liked Cyan, and I thought she was a fantastic character. We've got trans characters in this one, we've got a polyamorous relationship, and it was just nice to see that representation, to be in this world, and to be blown away by this book. I will definitely be reading more in this series. I have to say, this is one of the few books where I underlined things in as I was reading, because there were some sentences that were just such accurate depictions of the black experience in the contemporary world, even though it wasn't directly trying to be about that I loved seeing that parallel and how I could relate it to our real world while it was still so relevant and applied so differently in the science fiction world that the book is set in. Next, I have to talk about the best graphic novels that I read this year, and that is the March duology. Well, it's a trilogy, but I only read March volumes 1 and 2 this year, by John Lewis, Andrew Aydin, and Nate Powell. And these are memoir graphic novels about John Lewis's experience in the civil rights movement. I put 1 and 2 both on this list just because I read them back to back almost, so I can't remember specifically what happens in each one, but I gave both of them 5 stars, and I thought they were both fantastic. It was just so moving and so powerful to see these events drawn out with the illustrations. There was something about the black and white illustrations that showed how the situation was not black and white. It was not black people against white people in this situation. It was racist versus anti-racist, and the artwork kind of shone that and made it bold for me and threw it in my face. And the painful depictions of the suffering that people have gone through, just seeing it visually really affected me. I've read many books on this subject, I've read many books about this history, and I've studied it as well, but seeing it in the artwork just hit home in a different way. And I think these are really good, approachable graphic novels for people who want to learn more about John Lewis's experience, but also the civil rights movement as a whole. Pet by Akwaeke Emezi. When I read this one in February, I said it was going to be on my favourites list, and I was absolutely right. I loved Pet. I still have not stopped thinking about it to this day. So Pet is a young adult novel. We follow our main character, who is a trans black selectively mute main character, and she lives at home with her parents, and she lives in this place called Lucille where all of the monsters are dead, they are long gone, but it turns out there might be just one last monster left in Lucille, and she has been tasked to hunt it down with this mysterious creature who came out of a painting. And this book is riddled with metaphor, and I love that metaphor. The term monster in this one is a metaphor for many things, different things, and it was just so well done to see how that metaphor was played across the whole book. I really liked the writing. I thought it was absolutely beautiful. It wasn't lyrical, but there was something about it that made it unique and stand out to me. I really like the sentient house. The house is, I like to say, softly sentient. It's not very bold in the way that it is alive, but it reacts to her. It feels like home to her, which I really liked seeing. I loved seeing how the parents were so included in the story. Sure, the young adults are doing their own things and going off on their own, but teenagers have to think about their parents, have to think about curfews and such. So it's very nice to see how involved the parents were. I thought the ending was on point in terms of how effective it was, how much it drove its message home, and overall I just thought this was a short but really good book. Very, very good. The best short story collection, if not the only short story collection, but it was a jolly good one as well, I read was Objects of Desire by Clare Sestanovich, and this one I read fairly recently. It's a short story collection following these fairly young to middle-aged adults who are in their 20s to 30s, and they're in the peak of their life, the height of their life. They should be achieving those career goals that they wanted and having successful relationships and just having the best time of their youth, but all of these women are not, for different reasons. And some of these characters were quite unlikable, but with each character I felt like I could understand where they were coming from and I could relate to them. The author does a very good job of quietly bringing through an image all the way to the end, and at the very end you recognize what that image means and signifies and how it matters and is relevant to the story. And I loved seeing that. I loved seeing how discreetly and quietly that imagery and that poetic element to the short stories were woven in. You could totally ignore them if you don't feel like digging that deep and still get such a good experience from this. The ending to each and every single short story was incredibly satisfying. Perfect way to end them, perfect place to end them. And even though they are short stories, sometimes I felt like I'd been living with those characters for a very long time. Very good short story collection. Now I want to talk about the Binti trilogy. You can get it as a bind-up of the trilogy, so technically I am talking about one book, but Binti is the Afrofuturist book of my dreams. I really, really enjoyed it, and I think it got progressively better with each book in the series. They're a series of novellas, so they're quite short and frank and to the point. And we're following Binti, who is a character who wants to go to this prestigious school, but her tribe don't think that she should go, and she runs away and goes anyway, and she's on the ship that will take her to this school when something happens that is quite monumental and unfortunate, and it's about Binti's reactions to this, and that's the first book in the novella series. What I like about Nnedi Okorafor's writing style, which is very different from what I usually like, is that she doesn't inject emotion into her writing whatsoever. She really focuses on the events and the plot that is happening around her, and yet still her characters go through so much development and so much growth, even though that's not the focal point of the story whatsoever. I find that very, very impressive. She's created such a unique and wonderful Afrofuturist world. I loved it. I loved the concept of treeing and how it's something that I know I'd be awful at because I'm not mathematical whatsoever, but I still loved seeing Binti talk about it and her passion for that subject. I feel like I've read so many books where people are creative and passionate about that, but so few where they like something like maths and physics, but they feel that passion for it. So it's quite refreshing to see. Binti as a character is such a peaceful character, and even though she's going through so many moments where there's conflict, seeing her maintain that peace through those difficult times, even when she's questioning her own identity, I was very impressed. As I mentioned, it does talk about the topic of identity, which is one of my favourite themes to talk about, and it really goes through the whole of the 3 books, and I loved seeing each layer to that identity that was added, that was discussed and was broken down. It was beautiful. Another book I read this year was Beloved by Toni Morrison. This book absolutely blew my mind. Beloved follows this woman who is living in this house, and she used to be a slave, so that is in her history, and she is being haunted by this dead baby who died, and the baby is called Beloved, and it's about this woman and the people that live in this house that is haunted, why it came to be, and how their past and their present is affecting the events of their lives and the stagnancy of their lives. I think that's the best way I can describe this book, but it's just a book that you need to read to fully understand how much magnitude this book truly has. Toni Morrison has created this story where the characters are so woven into their past and what has happened to them and their experiences, especially looking at their experience of slavery. I think it's one of the few slave narratives I've read that has just hurt my soul while it is fiction. I was feeling everything, the degradingness of what they experienced, the horror, the atrocity, and she really deals with how that trauma does not go away. In the present day storyline that we follow, they are no longer slaves, they've run away, they are free, and yet they are not free of the suffering that they've been through because it is still affecting them and still affecting the choices that they're making in life in the present day. And the haunting narrative relates to the hauntingness of memories, and it was just so well done. I think in horror, can you classify this book as horror? Probably, but in horror, one of my favourite tropes I would say is when people are being haunted by ghosts but also haunted by their past and something that's happened to them which feeds into them being haunted by a ghost. It's a nice cycle that can be very rounded, but the way that Morrison does it is just on another level. It was absolutely amazing. The writing is beautiful. The book kind of switches between past and present very easily. It kind of flows through the timelines, and I feel like that can be confusing, but also it's just poetic and works so well for the narrative of the storytelling because it shows how the past and the present are all caught up in each other and cannot be untangled. There were some lines in this book that just hit me so hard. Oh, and I will keep thinking about this book for years to come. That book is amazing. My favourite classic that I read this year was Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. By far, that book just took me and ruined me because it was such a good book. So Crime and Punishment follows our main character who commits a crime, and it's a horrible crime, but he manages to get away with it. And it just follows everything that led up to that, and then a significant portion of the book follows him wrestling with his guilt but also trying to justify why he did what he did, and then deciding what he's going to do next for the rest of his life. And I thought it was just such an interesting book because there's so much commentary on the justice system in terms of what leads people to commit crimes, and whether the reasons why people commit crimes might sometimes be justified, might sometimes make a lot of sense, even if at the same time they make no sense. There's something awful, you can't do those kind of things, it's why they are called crimes. So it really deals with that complexity very well. And then after the event, because we know a crime is going to occur, it was so interesting to see how much he wrestled with his mental health, his feelings of guilt, his feelings of justification in times. And I just thought it was a significant journey, just seeing him battle with himself, with the justice system, with wanting to be caught and brought to justice while simultaneously wanting freedom and wanting to be okay and free from the situation that he's caused for himself. It was just such a remarkable book that I thought was so interesting and so intricately put together. I really liked seeing how our main character was going through a lot, but there was another character whose storyline seemed to echo that of the main character, and yet he chose some different pathways and avenues to go down than our main character did, so we could see kind of the alternate options that he could have taken and what those would have led to as well. So it was very good use of foil character in this one too. The ending was very satisfying for me. I was happy with where it ended. I was completely happy with the pace. It felt like I was reading a thriller, even though this is a fairly massive Russian classic. It kept going, there was always some momentum, and even though it was very character driven and thematic driven, I still needed to know what would happen next. So I thought it was a very well-rounded and very balanced classic read. Now I'm going to talk about the other memoirs that I read and really loved. This was a very good year for me with memoirs. One of them that I read was Maybe I Don't Belong Here by David Harewood, and if I was a crier, I would have been crying my way through this book because it focuses on David Harewood's experiences as a black British man who lives in the UK and had a psychotic breakdown. He went through psychosis and experienced psychosis, and a lot of that has to do with his identity and not fitting in as a black man in the UK and not feeling like he fit in amongst his white peers, amongst his middle class friends, and the impact of going to the UK, of acting in America, and seeing how those two different environments were very different, and how being black and British in those two different environments just had, that was so unique to each other, even though you would think that they wouldn't be that far from each other. I also thought it was really interesting to just read about his acting career. I did watch him in Robin Hood when I was younger, and I've seen him in other things, so it's just nice to hear about the acting side of things. But hearing about the mental health and his psychotic breakdown, and then also later on being triggered for it and talking about black mental health, all of it just pulled me so much and made me so emotional, because these are experiences that even if you don't have a full-on psychotic breakdown, you can relate to quite a bit as someone who is black and British. And yeah, I felt like I could relate to this. Felt like I know people who would have benefited from reading this book, and knowing that black mental health is a topic that needs to be discussed more, that needs to be brought to the light more, and seeing it being done in this book was just very emotional for me, for probably other black people who read it, but I urge other people too to read this just to learn more about what that experience is really like. I have no choice but to put Hope Not Fear by Hassan Akkad on my favourites list. This is a memoir about a Syrian refugee, a BAFTA award winner, an NHS COVID ward cleaner, and a powerful activist. That byline summarises this book very, very well, but it does not tell you how much this book is going to hurt your soul. I mentioned many heavy topics in this video, and of all the books that I've read this year, this was the book that weighed on my soul the most. I actively avoided reading it because it was just so much pain. I listened to the audiobook for about 5 minutes and had to switch back to reading physically because you could hear Hassan Akkad's voice trembling as he was talking about some of his most difficult moments. And this book is heavy, but as the title says, Hope Not Fear, even though it talks about so much fear and so much suffering and so much injustice and so much hate that people do not deserve to receive, it still manages to end in such a hopeful place and with such a hopeful note, thank goodness, because otherwise I wouldn't have been able to take it. Hassan Akkad, as a Syrian refugee and as someone who was an activist in Syria, went through so much, and the trauma that he's experienced and the pain that he's experienced in this one, you just have to read it to understand. Nothing I can tell you is going to equate to what really he went through. And I think what's really important with this book is that it shows how much, or it really humanizes the refugee experience. I know that being a refugee and the refugee crisis is a political debate, even though it really shouldn't be, because it's people's lives. I would like to give this book to everybody who says refugees should stay out of the country and they don't deserve to be here and they're a menace to society. You need to read this book because you are going to learn and you are going to be schooled and you are going to feel bad for what you've said after you've read this book. The part where it focuses on the NHS COVID ward was also really moving. It was hitting close to home because, of course, everything to do with COVID, as it's still ongoing, is hitting close to home. You should definitely read it and find out for yourself. Then want to give the time to talk about my two favourite poetry collections of the year. I read quite a bit of poetry. I love poetry, and one of the best ones I read was The Wild Fox of Yemen by Threa Almontaser. This was a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful poetry collection. This is one of the poetry collections that's heavy on the imagery and the metaphor, and all of that comes together to tell such an important message and give such strong emotion. So it's one of those books that's very rich in terms of literary devices. So if you're that kind of poetic reader, you are going to love The Wild Fox of Yemen. I would say the themes in this one are displacement, being from Yemen but not being able to be there because of how much the country is suffering, feeling that suffering in your heart and wondering whether you're justified feeling that suffering when you're not living there anymore because you've had to escape to somewhere safer. A lot of these have to deal with womanhood and what it's like to be a woman. A lot of them have to deal with what it's like to be Muslim, especially what it was like to be Muslim during 9/11, but also what it's like to be a Muslim woman after the events of 9/11 and every single day. The fox metaphor is woven into a few of these poems in the second half, and I thought it was done very well. It was very fitting and it was very smart. I drank these poems. Sometimes the format and the layout is done creatively, and I really like that. Seeing poems written backwards, or seeing poems where you can read the columns in different orders and the poem still adds up and makes sense. Marvellous. You can tell that this is a work of art, and I loved this poetry collection. The other poetry collection that I really loved is All the Names Given by Raymond Antrobus, and I would say it's quite different from this one. These poems are a bit more straightforward, so if you don't want lots of differing imagery and you don't want heavy metaphor, then this is the poetry collection for you, because the words are straightforward, they're succinct, but they are still very, very carefully and artfully chosen to drive home those messages, to drive home those emotions. So you're getting the same end result, but it's just going about it a different way. And I think this might be more approachable to poetry beginners, and this might be more approachable to advanced poetry readers. And I say that, which I shouldn't actually say, because it's saying that literary poetry is more highbrow, but that's what I just want to make clear so you know which poetry collection you should be going towards. This one is written by a mixed race, deaf poet. These poems have a lot to do with hearing and emotions through hearing, and he uses the help of something called closer captions, which I thought was a very clever way of doing it. And these closer captions are captions where sounds are described but not things that you could really hear, like the sound of a heart opening or the sound of a pulse racing. And I thought they were done brilliantly. I love the use of closer captions. It added to this collection all the more. I really liked the discussions on identity in terms of whether you're black enough, or whether you're black enough to fit into a space, or can you classify yourself as black when you've got Caucasian history and heritage in you as well. So I thought it dealt with that very well too. I have to say that this is split into sections, and the third and final section was the one that hit me the hardest, because it's based on true stories and true experiences of people who are deaf, who have encountered ableism in a lot of ways, and some of that ableism has to do with imprisonment and police brutality, and they're cases of things that happen that I never would have thought somebody would even do, because they sound so horrible and just so unjust, and I thought people wouldn't stoop to that level, but turns out people do. So it was very moving to read this poetry collection and to learn, but also to experience what it's like to have this kind of poetic view and this poetic perspective. Last but not least, I'm going to wrap up this favourites video with talking about my two favourite plays of the year that I read. One of them is A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry, and we're following this black family who live in a rundown apartment, and they are just trying to get by when they come into an inheritance. And all of the family members have different ideas of what or how they should spend this, of what they should do with this money and how this money should be spent. I loved how it was all set in a singular room, but it never felt like a limited space. I think the way that everything was laid out in this flat and the way that the setting fed into the play really suited the storyline. I loved seeing all of the individual characters Not all of them are likable, but all of them are going through different things. All of these character studies were given enough time and development. I thought it was so interesting that all of them had these ideas of how they would spend their money, ignoring the fact that a black man had to work and suffer and die for them to come into this inheritance in the first place. And overall it just touched on so many themes and ended in such a satisfying way that leaves you really, really thinking. It was a very satisfying play. And the last book I want to recommend here, as my battery is flashing at me, is Angels in America by Toni Kushner. And this is a play that is set during the AIDS crisis, and we're following these different couples and different characters experiencing different things throughout this crisis. And I'm trying to rush through this because of my battery, but each of these storylines are so different and individual and have different experiences with the AIDS crisis and how it's affecting their lives, and the choices that each character makes, whether these are the right choices or the worst choices, or putting themselves above others because of class or race. It's so good. It just showed how, even though it's one thing talking about AIDS and how it's touching people's lives, it's still got politics woven in, it's still got racism and homophobia woven in, and all of these elements will affect how the crisis affects your life. And it was very interesting as a play, and the way that the stage was used. I loved how the characters' storylines sometimes echoed each other, sometimes opposed each other, but they would all be on the stage and having these individual conversations, and yet the way that the dialogue flowed meant they were overlapping and talking about very different things while simultaneously talking about the same thing. It's hard to describe if you haven't read the play script or seen it performed, but it was so creative and so well done. I don't think I've seen dialogue and stage being used in that way before, and it was wonderful. And we've got images of religion and angels, which sometimes seems to be the opposite of things when you're talking about the LGBT plus community, but seeing how that imagery was fed into the play was very, very effective. I just want to see this one on stage because it had so much complexity and so many messages and things you can analyze and take out of it in a single play. So there you have it. Those are the 18 best books that I read in 2021. I want to know, what are some of your favorite books of last year? Put them in the comments down below. I need to read more good books. Please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Hit the subscribe button if you want to see more, and don't forget to hit that notification bell to be updated every time I have a new video. And you know what they say, onwards and upwards, Excelsior.